Time to bitch about Warframe lore. That's kinda my thing. Minor spoilers ahead. Anyway, among the ever-growing roster of Warframes, there are some that suffer from what I like to call Valkyr Prime Syndrome. This means that a frame can have critical lore elements that are thrown out of context by the existence or eventual existence of their Prime version. Valkyr was the first Warframe this happened to. The lore for her is that she was a victim of V's experiments. Her appearance and abilities were presumed to be a product of that experience, and the Valkyr Jersemi skin was meant to display Valkyr as she appeared before that time. That was the idea at the time, but then Valkyr Prime was released. Not only is the Valkyr Prime model based on the default Valkyr skin, her abilities are exactly the same, implying that the most V did was a change to her chassis. The existence of Valkyr Prime ruined the lore for normal Valkyr. One could maybe argue that the original Valkyr was a Valkyr Prime that was then experimented on, but that leaves the item description of Valkyr Jersemi skin into question, and the abilities are still the same. Alternatively, one could say that she was actually tortured and experimented on during the Old War, and then primed shortly after. This would imply that V is around the same age as Pravos Granum or even Teshin. Or perhaps Ballas looked into the future to see the fate of Valkyr and made a Prime in the process, because void bullshit. Either of these explanations would resolve the issue, but at the same time, both are huge cop-outs. It would be blatantly obvious that the writers didn't plan for this to be the lore. They could shoehorn this new lore in, or even rewrite what we currently have to make it make sense. But the fact that they even have to do this in the first place shows that they lacked necessary foresight. This is what Valkyr Prime Syndrome does to Warframes, and it's a huge problem because DE still does this. Another example of a Warframe that has this syndrome is Revenant Prime, but it's much easier to explain in his case. We can now say that Revenant was originally a Prime that was then transformed by Eidolon energy into what we see as normal Revenant. So the fact that Revenant and Revenant Prime have the same abilities and equipment makes sense. The only problem with this fact is that this was likely not the original intent of the writers when they first wrote the quest for him. They don't make lore for Warframes with their future Primes in mind. They probably meant for Revenant to originally have been any other kind of Warframe that was utterly transformed, physically and functionally. So, because of the dubiousness of Revenant's lore in the context of his Prime, he suffers from Valkyr Prime Syndrome. The same can be said about Varuna. If the Laverian story is to be believed, then her dog heads were originally actual dogs. Not exalted like Venari is for Korra, but their own independent beings, probably modified by a Helminth in some kind of way. But because of the principle that DE holds that every Warframe can and will be primed, we know Varuna will get a Prime in the future. And if you're watching this from the future, well, see what I mean? As I currently type this in 2023, I know for a fact that Varuna's dogs are going to function exactly the same as head attachments on her person. The Laverian lore suggests that when her dogs died, she severed their heads and used energized Kuva to not only revive them, but make them a part of her. And this all happened during the collapse, which means that there wasn't anyone around to make a Prime of Varuna in that state specifically. It wouldn't make sense lore-wise for her inevitable Prime to have dog heads, but do you know why her Prime will have dog heads? Valkyr Prime Syndrome. I don't imagine this sort of thing ending anytime soon, but if DE writers are to make lore for Warframes, they need to make sure it remains unaffected by Valkyr Prime Syndrome. And that's all for now. Have a good day.